John Kane here from Let's Talk Native. I want to spend a few minutes and explain what you probably don't really know about what are the laws relating to native gaming. Back in the late 80s, there were flourishing bingo halls in many native territories, and some casino gaming had been started in some territories. But a case out in California by a small group called the Cabazons went all the way to the Supreme Court. They were operating a high-stakes bingo game, and the state of California was trying to shut them down. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cabazons. It basically said, if the state has gaming, the natives can have gaming. It didn't make gaming legal. It affirmed what we had already assumed and what we already asserted, that we had the right to do this. So that Supreme Court decision did not give us a right. It acknowledged our right. So shortly after that decision, there was a scramble in Congress to pass an overall underlying federal statute that would somehow let the federal government have a stake in Indian gaming. So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was pushed through, only a year after the Cabazon case. And what that case did was that it laid a foundation in federal law that first did two things to protect Native people. It was supposed to protect them from organized crime, but it was also supposed to protect them from aggressive states, and states that would be non-cooperative to native territories and Native peoples. The other thing that it did is that it laid a foundation so that when we contracted with vendors, there would be a clear legal premise for them to contract with us. So if we, let's say, had a contract with a gaming supplier, their license to sell equipment or services to Las Vegas would not be jeopardized by them selling products or services to some rogue group of native gaming enthusiasts. So that's what IGRA did. But they laid out very specifically some of those protections. But I gotta say, again, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act did not make Indian gaming, native gaming, legal. It was already legal. It was legal before Cabazon, and it was legal before IGRA. But one of the things that this underlying federal law really tried to establish was that the states could not squeeze native territories. In fact, they even had a provision in the original draft of IGRA that said if a state refuses to negotiate a gaming compact, that the native territories could sue the state. Florida really took this thing, opposed this, and took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and they had to sever that portion of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So now, if a state doesn't want to negotiate a compact with the native territory, then the native territory can just work it out with the federal government and bypass the state altogether. But again, one of the things that the federal law was supposed to do was to stop aggressive states from taking advantage of native peoples. As such, it was actually prohibited by states from taxing native gaming. Let me say that again. A state was entitled to no revenue from Indian gaming. That's what the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act laid out. So all of you folks who've been following this Seneca thing and saying, well, the state deserves money. No, they don't. They don't deserve anything. They are entitled to nothing. In fact, the region is entitled to nothing. Now, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act did provide the means for revenue sharing to occur, but in order for revenue sharing to take place, the states had to provide a concession. They had to provide something of value to the native gaming enterprise and then receive revenue sharing in exchange for that something of value. The lead agency for enforcing the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is the Interior Department, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And it is very clear to them that in order for a revenue sharing agreement not to have the appearance of a tax, that the states had to offer a concession that was both substantial and quantifiable. And by substantial, it means what they offered in a concession had to have a value that was somewhat equal to what they were going to get in terms of revenue sharing. That is how revenue sharing occurs. Revenue sharing is not a one-way street. It's not just simply money flowing out of a native casino into state coffers. The state has to give something up for that. The most common concession that a state makes is some sort of exclusivity zone or exclusivity. States like Connecticut, they, for years and years, agreed that they would not allow any gaming in the whole state. Granted, it's a small state, but they would not allow any gaming in the state in exchange for revenue that would come from the Pequots or the Mohicans. New York State's proposal was not quite as lucrative. For one thing, they didn't offer an exclusivity for the whole state. They offered it just in a region. And then with some really kind of crafty wordsmithing, created some mechanisms for them to actually breach parts of the exclusivity while not breaching all of it, supposedly. What the state offered was an exclusivity zone for all of Western New York, 15 counties, where the assumption is the Senecas would have an area of non-competition. But the reality is the state has already been in the gaming business. Obviously, they have their lotteries. Every store, every bar, almost every street corner has a place where you can buy lottery tickets, quick draw tickets, scratch-offs, all of that stuff. That notwithstanding, the state went further into gaming. Their horse tracks have been a failing industry for years. So one of the solutions for the racetracks was to turn them into casinos. 3 of the racetracks that the state turned into casinos were within the Seneca Nation's exclusivity zone. So right out of the gate, the intent of that non-competition zone was breached by the state of New York. They took the Hamburg Fairgrounds, Batavia Downs, and Finger Lake Downs, those 3 horse tracks, and they turned them into fairly substantial slot parlors. They advertised them as casinos. The machines inside, they advertised as slot machines. So clearly, those 3 enterprises within the alleged exclusivity zone of the Seneca Nation the state was taking market share from the Senecas in those 3 locations. When the Senecas finally protested, the state was forced, in order to settle this thing outside of arbitration, the state was forced to give up $200 million to the Senecas to settle the agreement. $200 million. Of course, the state still continued with its slot parlors in these racetracks, although they said they would no longer call them slot machines and they would no longer call them casinos. But the smoke was out of the bottle. The water has already flown under the bridge here. These things were established gaming facilities within the Seneca's exclusivity zone. Now, the interesting thing is, the Senecas, their revenue sharing provision was a sliding scale. In the first few years, they were paying 18% of their slot drop to the state. In the next 5 to 7 years, they paid 22% to the state. And in the final 7 years of the agreement, they paid 25% of their slot drop to the state. Now, for what they paid to the state, 25% of that came back to the local communities. So all of the howling from Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and Salamanca, it has to be put in perspective. The money that they received paled by comparison to what Albany took out of the region. That's what people have to realize. And I don't think that's what people do realize. So now at the tail end of this 14-year period, which is clearly laid out in the compact, the state changes its constitution so they can now build casinos. And they build them, 4 of them upstate. 1 of them on the fringe of that exclusivity zone, but not in the exclusivity zone. But here's the question. For the state to have offered an exclusivity zone, protecting the Senecas not from slot parlors at the racetracks, but from full-fledged casinos, how is that a concession if they couldn't build them anyway? State law prohibited, the Constitution of the state of New York prohibited the state from building casinos. It actually prohibited slot machines, but they massaged what a Class 2 machine was versus a Class 3 machine. Doesn't make any difference to a player who walks into their facilities, but that's what they did. So now, the state is in the gaming business both as full-fledged casino licenses, there are racetrack casinos, there are racinos, and of course the lottery is everywhere. So even if this doesn't breach some of the language within the gaming compact between the state of New York and the Seneca Nation, the question goes back to the underlying federal law. Is what the state has offered to the Senecas worth 18, 22, 25%? Let me put it in its bigger number. Is it worth $1.5 billion that the state received? The state didn't build casinos in Niagara Falls because it couldn't. Not because of the exclusivity provision it provided, its concession to the Seneca Nation. It couldn't build the casinos. They weren't prohibited by the exclusivity agreement. They were prohibited by their own law. So what did they give up for $1.5 billion? And if you look at this from the underlying federal law statute, was the exclusivity provision legal anyway? Did they provide something that was both substantial and quantifiable? That's the question you have to ask. So I know a lot of people think the Senecas do owe the state something, but you're wrong. The question is, did the state get a bunch of money for nothing? Thanks.